Welcome to Athletes and Entrepreneurs, the Alumni Journey. I'm Rob Finkelstein, founder and CEO of Alumni Direct, where we've created a platform to help alumni and athletes network and connect with each other. But more importantly, this show is all about athletes transition out of sport. It's such a major issue today between health and financial literacy, career services. And we interview former athletes, college, professional athletes, and we talk about their journey and transition out of sports ultimately into successful business leadership and entrepreneurship. So excited today to have Andres Lares on. How you doing, Andres?
Good, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a pleasure. So Andres, he had it all going for him. He grew up, he was in Venezuela originally, came over to Canada, and he was a quarterback, tennis player, looking at multiple scholarships. Ultimately, he landed on Queens College. Unfortunately, his career kind of got derailed by injury, and that's something we'll talk a little bit about, throughout this podcast, because that's something that's big, whether it happens kind of before you even get a chance or along the way. It could be in college, it could be a professional athlete, and everybody's out there to help. So with playing at Queens College, he did stay in sports and was involved with the sports teams there. Ultimately, he went out when he was done, and he got into kind of the sports agency business, working with different athletes. Eventually went back and got his MBA in sports administration from Ohio University. And then after that, kind of decided to get more on the side of the teams and did a lot of work with some different professional teams in the NFL. And ultimately, today, he's the managing partner of Shapiro Negotiations Institute, which is kind of exciting. We talked a little bit offline. I'm interested to hear more about that, and we'll hear more about that later and share with our guests. So I always like to talk about, Andres, talk about growing up playing sports and how it shaped you ultimately leading up into college.
Yeah, and by the way, Rob, that's a heck of a way. I feel like you covered my entire life in like a minute or less. So that's pretty good. I should I should use that as an introduction from almost birth to now. But so thank you for that. And
You're welcome.
so I think team sports is super important, right? And I saw that growing up, and actually it was really interesting to see. I played tennis was probably my best sport, individual sport, and how different that was. But we kind of mentioned the scholarships. More of that came from the football side. I happened to play on a very good team, was fortunate, and was a quarterback, so I got probably more opportunities than I deserved. And I think of still the relationships I have from a lot of the teams I played with. We're talking certainly in high school, even as you mentioned, kind of get to Queens, and it didn't last long because of injury. Just the connections you make playing sports. I think it's kind of the team aspect. I think it's discipline. I think it's, even if you think of almost any team you've been on, playing your role, so you're focusing on things, the practice that it takes, that you're improving each time. So there's so much there. And so I think that's why athletes, if they're able to make that conversion, I think they can be very successful, because I think in their DNA, they've been trained to do some of these things very well.
100%. And was your dream of being a professional athlete? And what sport?
I think the dream very early on, I think would have been, as I got better. So I was nationally ranked in Canada, or in Ontario, I should say, for tennis. And so I think, um, the you realize very quickly when you see really, really good players that they're here and I'm here. So I'm not going to be the next Roger Federer, although at the time I guess he was pretty young. But I'm not going to be at the time maybe the Agassi or Sampras. And so you realize that. And then with football, I think a lot of the friends that I had, so they play in the Canadian Football League in the CFL. And I think this goes to a lot we're going to talk about today. That's a different world. We're actually starting to get a glimpse of accidentally on really the core, I think, and what your organization gets into is that I realized in the CFL you can barely make a living, right? And so you almost need a lot of CFL players to have a second job. And so it actually works out in their favor in the sense that they're playing professional football and making, some decent money, but they almost have to be thinking about post career or
Yeah.
almost second career during their playing days, which is a weird thing to say. That's a good thing, but to some extent I think it is, because they're kind of thinking of it all the way along rather than necessarily. I think some folks, if they're playing at the D1 level, even D2 level football, basketball, the open dream can be there and you got to work really hard to get there. But what happens if injury comes in, bad luck, all the other things that can occur in your life, and the balls don't bounce in your favor? So I accidentally kind of fell into that, and it was a really interesting experience to see how that kind of changed the fact that it wasn't life changing money, right? It was a regular job money.
Yeah, it's interesting to say that because I talk about, and we'll get into just the whole transition out of sports and education behind it. But I think to your point, different sports too. Like for me, I was a runner, and I ran high school and I ran a little bit of college. I got hurt my sophomore year, but yeah, I was on the fringe of varsity, and I wasn't going to be an Olympian or anything like that. So there was always that, not even to say the plan B, plan C, but the plan A, because I just knew I wasn't going to be. And I think if you look at that with other sports too, like a good example, I mean, it's changing a little bit today, but like basketball, like women's basketball, I mean, they know at the time, now it's more, it's getting more prevalent, but just that there wasn't much of a career after. I mean, you could be in the WNBA, but there's not a lot of money. I mean, I think things are changing now, with Caitlin and Clark and just, I mean, all these different people. But I think they realize that. Whereas, football, baseball, basketball, men's basketball, it might be a little bit different. And they've got like, hey, I want to be a professional athlete, and so they're kind of got the blinders on, and they're not doing that. So, but I think you're right. If depending what the sport is and where it's at, it makes a big difference.
And I think that when you bring that up, the makes me think that part of the reason some of the best are so good is their intent focus. Right, you hear the Michael Jordan story where he was cut, in his middle school team and didn't make it, and then that kind of fuels him. And I think so. We celebrate those stories because they are someone who's focused on something they want and they work extremely hard at it and are naturally gifted. All those things happen together. And I think so. What happens is, I think folks that don't make it, it is a very delicate balance. So I look at it now from the athlete side, right? And actually, what you opened with about injury, I mean, to some extent, I don't want to go as far as, oh, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. But an injury was a blessing in the sense that it made me
Right.
realize that I wasn't going to make it at the highest level earlier than it might have been. So it maybe developed some other plans. And so I think it's hard if you're an athlete and
Yeah.
you're pretty darn good, and you hear you're the best because you might be the best player in your high school team, and then you're pretty good at even the D1 level. Well, that's a borderline case, and you may be making it pro, but pro could be in Europe, and things may not work out for you. And so then, do you have a plan B? But if you have a plan B, then are you putting less into plan A, less into focus into basketball and all those things? So I think they're having resources and community around you and education, which is at the core of everything we're talking about today. I think is the important piece there because it can be a very difficult decision.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think in education, like you mentioned, it's key. And I think, like when we talked about this, and I think it's more, as we're older, you're not seeing as much. But I always ask the question about like education at the school, and we're going to talk about two facets here. We're going to talk about the school, and then also talk more at professional level because of your experience with the different leagues. But do you see a change at all in college sports of just trying to educate athletes more on not just that one class, but like, hey, there is life after sports, and preparing them, and not only preparing them, but also preparing the young alumni athletes that are out already that maybe they did play professionally, and all of a sudden 2 3 years they're done and they don't know what to do. They're spiraling. Have you seen any changes there with schools making an attempt to do more of that?
So I think there's more because I think there has to be more because there's a lot bigger dollars. There's NIL. I mean, I think there's more because they're forced to. Maybe not necessarily for the good reasons, but it is happening. The one example that I would bring up, and so this might be a unique one, so I think it's worth bringing up that maybe other guests of yours may not be able to refer to. So I volunteered and then worked with the Kingston Frontenacs. They're an OHL team, part of the Canadian Hockey League, and so those are ballpark 16 to 21-year-olds that play hockey. It's actually right now being considered, potentially semi-pro, but really that's the feeder to the NHL. Those are really darn good hockey players that, every year they're producing not only NHL players, but first round draft picks, right? So you have a good chance to make pro if you're one of the best players in that league. They're getting paid a small amount of money and they're getting kind of a family that they live in. That's kind of the system that you have. And there was, from what I saw, I don't remember seeing any type of education whatsoever of what happens if you make it, meaning that you have to kind of have the people around you to figure out what you do with the money and whether you go
Right.
back to school or not, all these things, or what happens if you don't. And I don't remember really either. And that is essentially you're going to try to make it to be professional. I'd say it's even further than the NCAA extreme because the NCAA up until now was a student athlete. Now, whether you believe students should have been there or not is a different story. But this was, really focused on just hockey and to try to make it pro. And I don't remember any of that. So I think that has definitely changed. And I'm glad to see it because you need it for both. It's not just the ones that don't make it, but the ones that do got to be prepared with the people around them because that can be a lot of money very quickly. And with that education, that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting to bring up the hockey. My last guest was a junior hockey player, professional hockey player, and he talked about. He brought up a scenario where there's a guy that he knows that basically is works with the minor league hockey players and helps them with the transition to the NHL team. So it looks like, I guess, teams are starting to do that where they've got some type of, I don't know if you want to call it player development or whatever, but working with those minor leaguers to prepare them to that next step of playing in the NHL.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's everything, right? It's the bigger stadiums, but also a lot more money, a lot more pressure. And for those borderline people, like in basketball, if you're in the G League back and forth to the NBA, if you're in the NHL, AHL back and forth, 3 or 4 games could be the body of work that determines your career. I mean, it's hard to
Yeah.
imagine that, but you're up 3 games in the NHL, you're up 3 games to the NBA, and then if you don't play well, that could be it for you. And so I think there's a lot there. Not to mention if you make it, obviously, the money's 5, 10, 20x, so it's a huge difference.
Oh, I mean, I guess it's kind of like in the NFL with the practice squad, right? If you're fortunate to
Same
make the
thing.
practice squad, you're kind of like in that limbo in between. You were good enough to get there, but not quite good enough yet, and hopefully you get that chance.
And AAA baseball is because
Yeah,
usually the best baseball player is AA, and then you make the jump to the to majors. So if you're in AAA baseball, you're a borderline lifer, right? And so you can be called up strategically, maybe if there's needs, but you maybe aren't the 18-year-old phenom or whatever. And so I think every sport has one of those, and I think that's the piece where the rubber meets the road there, where like that jump is dramatic, and you got to be ready for it in every way.
yeah, and so we're working on some different things, and we talked about it a little bit offline, but working on just trying to develop additional curriculum and workshops where we could talk about going into school with these different partners, resource partners in the health space and the finance and the career to not only work with the current college athletes but also work with the alumni athletes as well. But I think in continuing that conversation, and because you've been around the professional sports, what are you seeing there as far as alumni engagement of like from the professional level and education to them is that, hey, when they're done, here's things they can do.
So the alumni piece, and I deal a little bit less directly with that. The alumni piece, I think, is starting to crank up. I think the piece that definitely has dramatically increased is the pro leagues, all of them, in particular the NBA. I know better, has a real strong curriculum around basically for all the draft picks. You come into the league, enter the league, the rookies have a really strong curriculum there, and I think they've kind of realized it, right? They've realized that whenever if there's a significant issue with someone's money and they lose it all, or money laundering, or betting on games, or all of these things would be a major issue for that individual, but also for the league. So to some extent, for the better of every player, and also the PA as well, the Player Association, if they're going to help. So we talked a little bit about this offline, but I think both the league and the PA cares about it, and so that's dramatically improved. Now, education is a part of it, and this is a one-time thing, right? During your rookie year, you get some education. And I think a big part of it is also kind of who you surround yourself with and making those good decisions early on. But athletes are just like everyone else, right? If I think about you or me, you think about yourself when you were 18 and when you were 20, and you think about yourself 10 years later, and then 10 years after that, the experience and maturity also helps you make better decisions. It's just in this case, you might be handed a pot of a lot of money, and even if
Right.
you're not making it to the NBA, NFL, it's still that is a really critical time in your athletic career, whether you make it or not. And so that's the difference between a regular job where your
Right.
career is not necessarily set when you're 18 or
Yeah.
20 versus in the pros it would be.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I guess you kind of you alluded to it a little bit there, but networking and connecting is in general in life, it's very important. And when we talk about athletes, and I've had this conversation before with some other agents where they've said that the biggest failure they've seen is that sometimes these athletes, they just don't do it while they're playing, they're relevant, and it causes issues because now they've been focusing, they get done and they're like, okay, well, where's my six-figure job? And like, well, it might not be there because they didn't build those relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the benefit, maybe like some of the, whether it's the non-athletes, even the athletes in college, I mean, the ones that do take advantage of that whole networking. So talk about that and the importance of doing that.
I mean, I think certainly anyone, the further on they go in their career, the more I think they realize that networking is such a critical job. I think of my job, almost every single job I've ever had has come a result of not. It has not been a posting. It has not been an application. I've not submitted my resume. It's been relationships and networking, right? And so, and I think I actually liken it a lot to when I got to grad school at High University. I got some advice from some other colleagues. So the nice part about those programs that you're learning what in the classroom, but you're also learning from all your peers. And so, they talked about one person said something that really stuck to me. And when I go back and teach there, I say the same thing, or any other university I talk to, is just make sure you take advantage while you're in university and I say university because I'm Canadian, but college here, I'd say, and do the networking start before April of your senior year,
Yeah.
right? Because when you reach out to someone in your freshman year and your sophomore year, you're not yet looking for a job, right? And you're looking to tap into someone's experience. You're looking to get to know them. It's so what happens is that can be more kind of genuine networking where you're really looking to learn from them, make connections, and keep in touch. And that's one of the best things I did. I was there for 2 years of the 2 degrees. And those 2 years, I heard that pretty early on. It's one of the best pieces of advice I ever got. And so I focused so much on networking. And then step two was differentiating, okay, how to create relationships means kind of sticking your neck out, right? Like you cold call Rob and say, hey, you've got the job that I want. I want to learn from you. Or, you got lots of connections and friends in areas I'd like to get to. I want to kind of, whatever it is. But then step two, I also needed a lesson on and needed to learn from some other colleagues. I didn't really do this very well. Was okay. Now, what do you do to keep in touch? Because networking requires both of those things.
Right.
So I think for me, that was a total game changer. And then I would say that the exact same thing applies for an athlete. That if you wait until you're done, I don't want to use this word because I don't necessarily see it that way as working, but I think for other people, you may be less relevant, right? While you're playing, if you're playing in the NFL, even if it's a year, while you're in the NFL, there's a certain cachet around that. And if anything, you
Yeah.
can leverage that while you're an athlete, while you're in college sports. And so I think certainly you got to leverage it, but before you got to get to plan B is when you need to be leveraging it. And so that means you got to be thinking a couple steps ahead. And so, I think that really changed my career path. And so I can't stress that enough to, any athletes that are listening. I think that would totally be a game changer.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's great advice, and I think even I talk about sometimes to thinking back to like when you're in high school. I mean, just think about your teammates and their parents and the coaches, and it's never too early, I guess, to start to build those connections. I think the key there is the relationship, like you said. It's just it might not be something that happens right off the bat. It could be something 5 years later that you've built this relationship with somebody, and then all of a sudden an opportunity comes up. I mean, I always talk about sometimes it's not necessarily who you know, but sometimes who they might know, because you never know. Like you'd be talking to somebody like, oh, well, they're an accountant, and I'm in a sales career, so like, how are they going to help me? Well, maybe they're friends with the VP of marketing, or they're friends with the CEO of the company. You just don't know. So it's really important to tap into that. And then the other thing I always talk about with networking is I think it's having that kind of pay it forward mentality of just like, how can I help? What's going on in your life that I can do for you? And I have this conversation a lot, and I think what happens is sometimes people like they are intimidated. Well, that person's a multimillionaire. Or what do I have to offer to them? Well, you never know. I mean, maybe they have kids, and you have something that you could do to help their kids. I mean, it's important, I think.
And I think if it's genuine, I think that's one word I always like to use with networking. If it's genuine, I think it goes a long way. And what I've learned is having done that both sides, where I mean, I said like for 2 years, I was like a networking machine being guided by some of my classmates. And then now, one of the first things I did, so I teach at Hopkins, I'm an adjunct there, to just kind of stay involved in the community and teach undergrads, and I guest lecture at some places. And I think I do that on purpose to pay it forward, mentee, serve as a mentor to some folks. And I think there's in many cases, yes, I have a lot more experience than some of those folks, but it definitely becomes two ways. And I can think of some of my mentors were now to some extent I've been able to help them now through my career, and certainly some of my mentees that have helped me. I mean,
Yeah.
that definitely will happen, right? If you're thinking about the long game, right, over time. And so now that I've seen it both ways, I don't know that I could probably say honestly that I don't know that I believe that early on, in the sense like, how am I ever going to help these people? But I
Right.
think now over time, some of the very people that helped me, when I was in grad school, 15 years ago, they've reached out for help when they need something, because now I'm well into my career and I'm in a position. And so if you think of it in the long game and you're genuine, and that also means that not everyone I talked to I kept in touch, right? Some people you just didn't, you didn't have that connection with, or you didn't have as much in common. But yeah, I mean, I love that, and paying it forward. I mean, that's just my pitch for Ohio University, but that's
Yeah.
one of the things they do best, is that the alumni is very strong because they feel like you have to pay it forward. You owe something really to others that come behind in the program, and so Alumni Direct being kind of what you're doing, I think I had to at least put a plug in for Ohio University.
Yeah, no, for sure, and that's great because you want to see universities doing that. I mean, we talk about alumni engagement, and a lot of times the schools I think struggle with that. Yeah, a lot of it's obviously it's fundraising, and that's sometimes, although they need to raise the funds, it's kind of a turnoff to the alumni. But I think more so is just the athletes, maybe the athletic department bringing alumni back, alumni athletes, and whether it's working with the kids in their sport particularly. I bring up I was on a call with a former Hall of Fame player from my school and ultimately played 10 years in the NFL. And we were talking to the athletic department about mentoring, and they were just saying, they kind of struggle with that. And he's like, tap me in. I mean, you got a Hall of Fame guy here, you got a 10-year NFL guy. I'm willing to help. And I think it's got to be a two-way street. And probably some of it, you worked in, with the athletics there when you were at Queens. I mean, I think it's sometimes a challenge too. I guess if it like a new athletic director comes in or new coaches, maybe that, but they seem to be focused on the current, what's going on now. But I think they definitely need to tap in alumni.
And I think it's got to be a separate a person or group, right? Like if you look at athletic director, I hate to minimize it. There's a lot of things. It's a big job, but fundraising is a very significant portion of an AD's role. The coach, obviously, wins and losses is a big part of how he or she is graded. And so I think neither of those two are perfectly connected to then someone really having a kind of a alumni connection piece. And so if you're thinking of the student athlete in particular, I think it's two parts. One is how well do you do it after, and making sure there's value for everyone. There's value for maybe the alum. There's value for the people in school, the community. And then I think the piece of it too, like you said, is again also it's got to be genuine. If it's just if I'm just calling Rob a few times to get him connected, so then I can just ask him for money,
Right.
people can see right through it. But you can add a lot of value outside of money, right? I mean, if you think about just the things that I mentioned already on this podcast,
Yeah.
most of us I learned from classmates or alums, and so that's worth a lot more than if they had donated a little bit of money to the school. I mean, the donations are helpful, but it doesn't start and stop there.
Yeah, I mean, I always tell the story. I get this call from the 302, which is in Delaware, and okay, here comes this student trying to hit me up for money. And like one time, I just said, "Listen, I was the president of my alumni club down here in South Florida for about 7 years." I said, "I put more time and effort into this alumni club and helping other alumni that far outweighs in the value of me giving some type of donation. Like I'm donating my time and everything else, and not getting paid for it, and I'm not expecting or wanting to get paid for it, but." You're right. I mean, there's more to it than just giving that donation.
And I think having gone to a couple schools, like I see what Queens does, and again, it's a Canadian environment, it's a little bit different. But I've actually had some really interesting conversations with kind of presidents and ads in Canada versus the U.S. Of I actually think the U.S. does a much better job because I think they're bigger schools that have larger athletic departments, so they need to raise more money, so they stay more connected because they need to raise more money, and so it's interesting. But I think it also starts with what's your experience at the school, right? So it's exactly what we're talking about today. So, Rob, if you're my coach and I'm playing, let's say I'm a women's volleyball player, and I see you both as a great volleyball player, a volleyball coach, but also either you, your assistant coaches, or someone else within the university is helping me prepare for a post athletic career. And if I think that helped me, 3 years down the road, of course I'm going to want to help. That's either with money if I have it, or with time, or
Right.
mentoring. And so it also starts with, and so again, you can see the passion of people. If they went to the university and they're still very passionate, that's a very different conversation. You're going to have like the NFL pro that says, raising his hand, hey, I'm ready to help here, and kind of pay it forward. And so I think it also, you have to be thinking about that experience.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, Andres got to listen to some of these my prior podcasts. I don't know if he got to this part yet, but I've got two questions for you. They're pretty easy questions, but what advice, 10 words or less, would you give to freshman Andres?
Um, so I was thinking about a couple of things before today, and I feel like after the conversation, I got to stick with the one that I said, which is recycling. But I think it would have to be that network genuinely as early as possible. I think it would be. I think that's kind of what I would recommend to myself. I think looking back to freshman me,
That's awesome. And how about senior you?
senior you, then I think it would be around. This is a marathon and not a sprint. I think that would be and so have context. I think that would be kind of the framing around it. I remember I started going back to speak at OU Symposium, which is kind of right when they graduate, and you see people, those that have a job are cool and calm and collected, and those that don't are hurrying to get a job. And I've literally started to track it, and I've been talking about it with some folks that also went through it. That there's zero correlation between those that had a job early on when they were finishing school and they were highly successful in their careers, and vice versa. And so I think having context around, this is a marathon, not a sprint, I think would have been good to know.
That's great. So yeah, sometimes I get I get really long answers. Sometimes I get a little stunned look like, oh boy, what version am I giving on this answer? Am I going to go the PG version or am I going to go the other version? So once so you're done with school and you kind of had, I guess, a couple transitions. I mean, obviously transition when you couldn't play anymore, but also when you were finished up, you said you got into, the sports agency and all that, and then ultimately got into sports administration. Talk a little about your transition out of, I guess, from college into, professional sports, and then, talk a little about that journey of, being on the one side of the agency side of the player agent to go into the other side.
Yeah, because I think mine. Eh, I did. I lost early on the dream, or not early on, late, but at least early enough that I could pivot to a career in sports rather than being a professional athlete. But I think for me, um, the transition, I think it's coming to terms with it is one part of it. So at some point, whether you're Michael Jordan or Wayne Gretzky and have to lace him up and you don't play anymore, and it can be hard, right? You see Tom Brady comes back from retirement, Michael Jordan comes back from retirement. I think so. It tells you how hard it is, even for the best of the best that have done it. It's hard to do it, and so I think the biggest thing, and I don't know that I was mature enough, and even actually until basically we prepped for this podcast, I don't know that I thought about, but I think it's you almost have a maturity around understanding when you're going to hang it up and that it's done, right? And if I'm a big Roger Federer fan. I love tennis, and you see how impactful, how difficult that was for him, and he kind of made the decision. Nadal's doing the same, two of the greats in tennis. So you see what it means to them. But I think is if your entire identity is who you are as an athlete, I think those are the ones that suffer. So we talk
Yeah.
about plan A and plan B. That's part of it, kind of having what else would I do. But I think also what you see yourself, because if you don't make it, then are you a failure? And so I've seen the quote really a lot circulating in Facebook and LinkedIn. A Giannis, and I don't know if you've seen this. Oh, so the Milwaukee Brewers basketball player, sorry, not Brewers, the Milwaukee
The Bucks.
NBA player, the Bucks. And one of the things that I love about it is, basically asked him, was this season a failure because he didn't win the championship? In short, and he said, if you don't get promoted every year, is that a failure? And what he talks about is like every day you're chipping away, you're doing your best, but that's not a failure. You're working towards success. And I love that. And I think if you're thinking about it holistically, and so your focus isn't entirely on, if I'm winning championships or I make it pro, that doesn't define who you are. I think those will transition a lot smoother. I think it's those that don't have an identity outside of sports. That's where the real struggle is.
Yeah, no, it's funny. We were talking like as a fan, let's say baseball, for example, you got this guy and he's hitting like 180 or 200. He's on your team. And like, this guy's horrible. What's he doing? But realizing that he's like one of the best baseball players in the world. I mean, to be able to make it to the major leagues, but like, it's just like as fans, we're so jaded because like the numbers aren't there, but really like so many people failed and here they are, they get to that level and what seems to us to be a failure. I mean, congratulations for becoming like a major league baseball player, just like really in any sport, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. 25-man roster in baseball. Let's say 30 teams. That's what 750 players. So like that means you're one of the best 750 players in the world for a sport that's played by, whatever it is, must be a billion or something close, right? I mean, maybe it's not as much as soccer, but so same, right? If you're a soccer player and you're playing for Arsenal, it happens to be our household supports them. Then if he's not playing well, that you are one of the best X 0.001% of the world. That's impressive. And that also one other note about this is confidence. I think that's what actually makes sports so interesting to work in is that it's not like being a venture capitalist or a stockbroker. Or, your asset is people, right? And so what happens is like what happens if they go through a divorce? What happens if they're having troubles with their kid at home? What happens if their mother passes away? What happens if they lose confidence because of an injury? And that happens to the athlete that
Yeah.
that might be listening to this. That happens to so that's what makes it so unpredictable. And so I think the confidence in yourself, I think, is so difficult but so important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's we're talking about the athletes. Talk a little bit just about the athlete's skill set in the DNA, and companies want to hire athletes. And I think, we've kind of talked along the way about athletes, struggling and identifying themselves as, the baseball player, the football player, the swimmer. And once they're done. So in your experience, either as hiring or just what you see out there, to, kind of encourage athletes that there's a lot for them after they're done.
Yeah, I think the In particular, student athlete, because that means you had to be, if you took it seriously and you were in school, especially pre NIL, that is an unbelievable amount of work. I mean, now with NIL, it's going to become almost more pro than it is college, so it's a little
Right.
different. And it's certainly not to say that pro sports isn't hard. It's you're literally doing it every single day. But I think in what the discipline to have to kind of go and try to improve and perfect your craft every day, teamwork, discipline, right? Because you got to work in teams, all the same things that are valued in any organization. So I think I think people shouldn't discount that experience, right? And for anything, I mentioned that I think the tie goes to someone who's a student athlete because I think it's hard to be able to balance both things, right? Time
Yeah.
management skills, all of those things to be really good. And I think not to mention kind of cool and calm under pressure, right? The best athletes are able to kind of slow things down under pressure. So these are all skills that I think are valued in just about any role. Communication skills, right? And so one thing that I've always found interesting is I like to sit sometimes with scouts if we're ever working with a team, and not necessarily for what I do for helping them negotiate the player deals, but just to kind of learn. And what you see is they'll be looking at Rob sitting on the bench beside the coach, and they see kind of the way they interact with the coach and the way they act with other players, and that tells them a lot about that person. And so, like, those are the details they're looking for to see, like, how do they communicate? For example, when Jimmy, Rob's teammate, misses a shot, do they shrug and are they disappointed they did that, or they come over there and kind of, give him a hug and he missed an important shot to lose a game, and they're the first ones to prop him up, right? And so, those are kind of extreme examples, but I found that very interesting, and I think that's a lot of the same skills you're looking for in any organization, whether you're in sports or not. And so, I think they translate quite well.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree. And then last question before I want to kind of get into just talking about what you're doing today, but talk about the importance of community and just especially kind of the athlete community and bringing people together.
It can be a lonely road, I think, without it. And so I think of those that have a community. I think that's just such a great resource that you don't necessarily have to tap in all the time. And I think it's a give and take, as we've said today. It's the same in networking, right? So sometimes in the community, sometimes I'm going to give and I'll help others out. And sometimes when I need it, I'm going to be able to take, right? And take can mean getting advice, getting a connection, helping getting interviews, role playing for a presentation, whatever it is, right? Figuring out what other jobs you could do, finding out what classes you could take, could be anything. And so I think if there's the give and take of the community is what makes it so powerful. So I think in just about any place in life, I think we're looking for mentors and we're also looking for communities as resources that can help us be successful.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about. So it's kind of interesting. Talk about what you're doing today. You're the managing director of Shapiro Negotiations Institute. You were telling me a little bit about, but share what you're doing there.
So, Shapiro Negotiations Institute is a negotiation training company at heart. Essentially, it was founded 29 years ago by Ron Shapiro. So he was a really successful baseball agent, and so I joined about 15 years ago. About 7 or so years ago, he ended up taking a step back, and so I took over with a couple partners. And so, essentially, we are a negotiating training company that I would call almost two parts of the business. There's one part which is very relevant to today, and that's the sports piece. We call it kind of our sports practice. We help teams negotiate player contracts. So it's really on the team side we're advising. And then we also have over years grown into the sponsorship side as well, kind of the business side. So basically any major negotiations the team does, we advise on. And then on the other side of the business, kind of the bigger and the growing part is the non-sports, which is where we basically train executives, salespeople, procurement, just about anyone how to negotiate. And so generally tends to be kind of Fortune 5,000 types of companies. And so we do that in 7 languages. So that's a little bit about us. We're based in Baltimore. And although, that doesn't really mean much these days with remote working, so our people are spread out all over the world.
So what, like, when you're working with like some of the negotiations with these companies, like, I guess what kind of is it teaching them different skills to do it? Is it more? Is it also helping them maybe like kind of researching, like if they are like in negotiations to whether it be buy a company or they've got a big proposal out there that they want to try to get from a sales perspective.
So it'll be, we think of, let's say, a sales organization. Let's say they got 500 people, and usually comes because of a challenge, right? They'll have a challenge. There's a new entrant in the space. Margins are eroding. They're having trouble differentiating from the competition. Um, they can't. They're having trouble pushing through price increases. Kind of, especially during COVID. Things like that, or procurement. Procurement's being told that they have to maintain pricing, but tons of inflation, and they're having trouble negotiating. So it usually comes with some challenge And then usually we're training that entire portion of the organization. So it's an entire sales team. And so, think of it as a couple days in the classroom and some reinforcement, and it's tailored to them. So the idea is that when we're going training Sherwin Williams, that's going to look very different than when we're training PwC. Because, while there's still common language, still, we teach what's called the 3Ps approach. So this was kind of founded by Ron and back in the day his partner Mark too. But it was prepare, probe, propose. And so really we're focusing on these are communication skills. We're teaching them how to prepare efficiently, right? Because we all know preparation is important. And in this, if we're talking to athletes, they know that as well. So but it's how do you do that efficiently? Number two is probing, which is all about deep discovery. And really it's about helping the other side or uncovering what's important to the other side, getting beyond their position onto their interests. And then lastly is propose. When we think of negotiating, we all kind of think of that, the back and forth. But usually most of the work's been done beforehand, right? If you've done a job, you've developed a relationship, you understand what they care about, you're very well prepared. The proposing is the easiest part.
Got it. There's a lot there, and I guess it sounds like an exciting space, especially since you're bridging both the sports world and the corporate world. So how can people find you and find the company?
Yeah, and for the record, I think this is a perfect example of everything we talked about today. I fell into this by accident through relationships, essentially, with some luck as well. And so I didn't even know this existed. And I came for the sports piece, and then they're expanding it. So even though it's almost like the non-sports expansion of learnings for me have happened by accident. But generally, the two best places I'd say is find on LinkedIn or on our website, yourpowernegotiations.com. Are trying and more so every day to post as many resources as possible. So great if there's clients that want to come on, but even if those that can't or individuals that are looking to learn, it's a great place to find a lot of negotiation resources.
All right, that's great. And people have to check it out there. You can find us at alumnidirect.com. The podcast is both on our YouTube channel as well as across all the podcast networks. And this is such an important topic. And, Andres gave us some great advice today, and the other, athletes who proceeded on the podcast is just, we want to help athletes out. Just know that there are people out there that want to make a difference, and just, listen to advice and be willing, be open to it, because you don't have to struggle alone. I mean, there are people out there that have gone through it and had a lot of success. So again, thank you so much for being on with us today, Andres.
Appreciate it, Rob.
You're welcome.